Hello, Scott. This is going to be my first video, and I want to preface it by saying that I am a fan in the sense that I think you are an eloquent guy, and you've got a lot to say which is worth hearing. And you say it in a manner which is not abrasive. You can present your ideas in a way which is worth listening to, that is. However, there are times in your videos where the real issue, the real meat of the argument sort of gets swept under the proverbial table, and the dog gobbles it up, and then everyone just starts eating the meal, and they don't notice that the steak has become dog food. So, here's an example from one of your latest videos, and I really would appreciate it if you would take the time to sort of work through the real meat. I know that you have an appreciation for rigor in that sense, and I really respect people that have an appreciation for rigor because they're not as lazy. At least Daniel Kahneman, a famous psychologist and winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, would say that the system 2, or type 2 thinking, the logical type of thinking, that logical part of your brain is not quite as lazy as most people's. Not to say that most people are lazy, although they might be. Who knows? I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. At any rate, let's get to the meat of my problem with some of your videos. In one of your more recent ones, Non-Belief Revisited, which is really a discussion between you and Noah, which was quite profitable and civil and nice, and I really enjoyed following it. You start talking about knowledge at about 5:21, if I'm not mistaken, in your video. And you say, well, knowledge is justified true belief. And that is a model which was very popular ever since the time of the Greeks. I believe it was after Socrates, so it was post-Socratic as far as philosophy goes. And ever since that time, there was really not very much opposition to it, even from the most anti-Greek philosophers to have ever existed. For example, the famous English empiricists, such as John Locke and David Hume. And it really didn't become a gigantic issue, even though that Hume mentioned this in an inquiry concerning human understanding, until 1963, when something was introduced in psychology, or not psychology, philosophy rather, well, kind of both, called the Gettier problem. And the Gettier problem has to do with what we consider justified true belief. It gives examples, basically, of where we have a belief which is justified, and somehow it ends up not being true. And the fact that it's not true, we can never glean from the fact that it happens to actually be justified. For example, I believe that I have a thermos of tea sitting here. Darjeeling, it's lovely. At any rate, the reason I believe this, and the reason that that belief is knowledge, is because it's justified by the fact that my sense organs are telling my brain, hey look, there's a metal, ceramic sort of thing over there, and there's a hot liquid inside. That's my sense organs talking to my brain, and that's the justifying step. There's no real cognitive step other than that, other than me interpreting it as being accurate sense data. Now, you, to your credit, start talking about how, well, this plays into cognitive neuroscience, which I believe is the right track, but then you go on to say, well, at the level of, putting someone under an fMRI or something like that, you're not going to be able to tell the difference in brain function between somebody believing something and somebody knowing something, but that is an effective bastardization of the context of the original question. The original question wasn't, well, what is it that gives rise to feelings of certainty, which is essentially what that is. It's saying, well, if we're certain about something, the same parts of our brain are involved. Yeah, that seems to me to be quite reasonable. The real question is, when we are certain of something, how do we go about classifying it as somehow hierarchically more apt at describing reality than something else? How could we say, well, I've got an idea in my head, and it's that in fact, the Earth is round, or a sphere, and it goes around the sun, and that, well, that idea is somehow better or more descriptive of reality than saying, well, the Earth is on the back of a giant turtle. That's the real question, and we've effectively bastardized the context of this part, and we've swept around 2,000 years of discussion by very brilliant men under the table. And so that's why, after we've sort of gotten this distinction off the table, and the real meat of the argument has been destroyed, you go on to say, well, yeah, there's no difference between filial knowledge and, well, there is a difference, but in a sense, filial knowledge is never anterior to propositional knowledge. Well, again, you have to define knowledge a lot better than you've done in order to make that statement. The idea about which is anterior to which is always difficult in philosophy because of, obviously causation and correlation problems. Is one the effect and one the cause, or do they sort of arise together, or is the other the effect and, the other the cause? Well, that's really hard to distinguish. And I feel like, in your case, that is where the argument sort of became, or the discussion rather, became meaningless. I'd like to revisit it with you because I feel like, in a sense, the idea of filial knowledge is not very descriptive. We could come up with better ideas, or in the Bertrand Russell sense, in a thing that he wrote called On Denoting, he talks about how we can clear up lots of philosophical problems just by using good language. I feel like that's true, and if we say something like, well, let's not talk about filial knowledge, let's talk about some a priori sense of knowledge, which could be filial in the sense that it's relational and deeply intuitive. And I feel like that's what is really meant by filial knowledge. It's not, synthetic in the Kantian sense, or it's not a posteriori, but still, that's what we really mean when we say filial. So I would like to revisit this with you, because I know that you have a genuine interest in being rigorous, and that you like epistemology, and I'm frankly very interested. So if you have the time, and you've watched this video, cheers!